Welcome back to Ride JBI. I'm JB. This is our second Ducati Desmo450 video. Now in this one, we're going to take you on the inside of these Showa forks that have been built for this Ducati. We're going to talk about a little bit of what we found on the inside, some parallels and similarities to the other Showa forks that are on like the Honda and Kawasaki and Suzuki models, and then give you a little bit of insight to the first JBI spec setting that we're going to develop and put into this fork and go test with. So stay tuned. I think you're going to really enjoy what we share. All right, you guys. So the Ducati Desmo450 comes with Showa 49mm twin chamber spring forks. Now these forks have been out since 2017, and they first debuted on the 2017 Honda CRF 450R. Over the years, there's been about 3 different generations of this fork. What we have to the left of me is going to be the 3rd generation of the fork, so the most recent one. However, there's 2 variations of how this fork is provided. So I'm going to explain to you now what I see, taking my first look at what's on the inside. So let's start with the compression assembly. That's going to be the piece up top. So it has the same exact cap clicker assembly that we've become familiar with. However, it is a black color, which I think is pretty cool. All the other ones are typically gray. Anyhow, the actual fitment, function, and everything is identical, so no changes to that. Now, this compression assembly is very similar to what you would find inside of the 2024 to 2026 Kawasaki KX450. The reason I say that is for 3 main components that I find in here. The first one is going to be the pressure spring. The pressure spring on this one is not preloaded. I share that because on the Honda, the pressure spring is longer and it actually preloads the plastic free piston that we see here. So that's why it's more in common with the Kawasaki. Now the second item that really stands out is going to be our free piston. That is the white piece here with the bushlings, the O-ring, and the free piston seal on the inside. Now it is made out of plastic instead of aluminum. The aluminum version comes on the Honda. I can't really say yet, based on our limited experience, on which one works better. By limited, I mean only a few years of getting to compare the two, but there hasn't been any standout differences, whether the free piston is made out of metal or plastic, because the overall design is identical, and the rest of the parts that fit it, such as the bushings, seals, and O-ring, are identical as well. Thirdly, the last piece that stands out is the compression post. That is the gray piece right here. It is no longer a subvalve. So this very much looks like what you'd find inside a Kawasaki. However, the settings they have in here are very unique to the Ducati Desmo450. So now let's shift our focus to the rest of the cartridge. Now let's shift focus to what we call the mid-valve assembly on the cartridge rod. As we talked about earlier, we're seeing a lot of similarities with the Kawasaki KX450. One of those is going to be the rebound post and how the shim stack and the mid-piston assembly mounts to it. The valving in here, and I'd say overall, is very traditional valving. There's nothing wildly interesting or crazy about it, and I think that's a very good thing. I share that because if you've ever ridden a Honda from 2017 to 2025, especially if you've ridden them back to back to back, like different years in stock form, you'll see that their stock valving changes a lot from year to year, and it's never been very too traditional, in my opinion. I think this is one of the reasons why the Ducati has very reasonably good performing stock suspension. By no means are we saying it's great, but overall it just performs as you would expect suspension to perform. Good job to Ducati for just doing some good overall settings inside these forks, and it gives us a very good baseline to start from. In terms of this fork spring that's inside of there, it is a 475 length of spring. So that is what you see in all of the other Showa fork models, with the exception of the 20 and 25 Honda CRF lines that went to an inch longer spring, which is 500 millimeters instead of 475. Now, technically an inch is 25.4 millimeters long, but I'm just approximating here, guys. Now, they do utilize the plastic spring seat right here. In the past, the spring seat used to be metal on all the other models. All the brands are now utilizing the plastic spring seat. One thing I do appreciate is that they still are utilizing 2 different preload grooves inside of this cartridge, so we can adjust spring preload. Honda went away from that in 2025 and maybe even 24. Don't quote me on that. And I can't see why, because in order for them to engrave another circlip groove into the cylinder, cannot be more than just a couple cents, if that. So it's very nice for us as tuners to have the ability to minorly adjust your preload. We can add some or we can reduce some. So I'm glad to see they have that feature left in there. So now that you're hearing a lot of Kawasaki similarities, you're thinking, what else is Kawasaki? Well, that's about it. because we have found out that the upper tube right here is actually, oh, that's some good sliding. Let's get both. Come on. There you go. So our upper tube is pretty much the takeoff from a Honda CRF 450R. So if you got some of your own Kashima coated Honda CRF tubes lying around, or just some other tubes that you like from Honda, they're going to fit right up onto the tube and right into the triple clamps perfectly. And then our lower chrome tube, well, that's been shared among all the different brands, and it's not changed over the, what is 2017 to 2025? 8 years. Thanks. Anthony's quick. That has not changed over the 8 years that these Showa forks have been out. Now, the one unique feature is going to be the lug. And the lug is different on these bikes. Most specifically, it is how the brake caliper mounts to it. So if you're thinking, cool, I can use my Honda forks, you're going to have some holdups in that area. Maybe if you swapped over your entire front brake system in line, you can probably do it, but it's not going to mount up right away. Maybe we've tried. So now that you guys have an initial impression on what we're finding in terms of the hardware inside, I'm going to let Anthony take over and give you some insight to what he's been feeling for just over about the past month as he's ridden it around all the different tracks that we have here in Southern California in all different conditions. And he's going to share with you his feedback and his overall experience that's going to help guide us along with my own experience riding the bike on what settings we're going to develop first to install into these new Showa 49mm forks for this Ducati Desmo 450.
All right, you guys, now that you know more about the Showa 49mm twin chamber spring fork that comes on the all new Desmo 450, we're going to dive into my riding impressions of this all new bike. Now, if you want to know more about the general bike itself, that being the power, the chassis, suspension, brakes, a complete overview of the bike, check out our episode 1 up on the Ride JBI YouTube channel. This video will be specifically focused on the suspension, that being the front forks and the rear shock that comes on this bike. Now, overall, the suspension package is quite impressive for a stock motorcycle. Usually there's a glaring positive or negative with stock suspension valving. Now, what the Desmo 450 does best is a very well-rounded overall setup. And what I mean by that is there's no glaring positives or negatives from this suspension. As we know, the hardware is very, very good. And with our JBI spec suspension valving and hard parts, we're only going to make the suspension better, which is a really good sign for you consumers out there who are interested and using JBI spec suspension. To talk about small to medium bump compliance, I do think that is one of the strengths of the Showa 49mm twin chamber spring fork on the all new Desmo 450. It's not an, oh my god, wow, this is so plush over every small to medium chowder bump, but it is a nice and comfortable feeling going over those bumps. I will say at higher speeds, however, during aggressive riding or even really pushing your limits and testing out the bottoming resistance from these front forks, that is where this fork lacks, in my opinion. As the track starts to get rougher, jumps start to fade away, this suspension does not hold up to the more aggressive styles of riding, whether it's an intermediate, expert, or advanced level of riding. So for me, the forks were underdamped, as well as the shock was underdamped, which we'll touch more on in just a second. One of the problems I was running into, though, is the forks are a little bit oversprung, but again, underdamped for me. These come standard with a 5.0 Newton fork spring. For me, about 155 pounds, give or take a pound or two, depending on how many cheeseburgers or burritos I eat during the week. I usually run a 4.8 Newton fork spring on a 450. So we're going to drop that spring rate just a little bit to better suit my weight, so that way we achieve proper ride height. But we're also going to improve the suspension valving, get a little bit more hold up with our fork volume spacer, and again, max out that bottoming resistance with our JBI Titanium Pro Perch, which we will touch on more in another video. Touching on the shock, the Showa, I think they call it the mono shock is what Ducati is calling it. Very similar to what comes on the Kawasaki KX450. As JB alluded to, touching on the hardware of the front forks, very similar to the Kawasaki. Well, it's pretty similar story out back. Again, just the names are changed. One of the main differences and obvious and glaring differences is going to be the shock clevis area. That has a very different, unique design, and the rebound adjuster is actually a little bit offset from the compression adjuster. It's actually quite harder to reach the rebound adjuster. It's not the end of the world, but then again, just something to note. Outside of that, it does have a bleed bolt in the shock body, so for myself, JB, that's a huge help, and other suspension tuners out there. I think you guys are going to really appreciate that. As noted with the front forks, I feel like the shock is lacking a little bit of progression throughout the stroke and bottoming resistance once again. Now, To match the front fork spring rate, this has a 46 Newton shock spring, which comes standard on this bike. After about 2-3 rides, we went ahead and switched to a 44 Newton shock spring rate. Now, you might be hearing those spring rates and thinking to yourself, man, that's pretty similar to the KTM rates. And bingo, that is exactly right. It is not the exact same linkage system. Of course, this is proprietary to Ducati, but the same linkage rates can be used pretty much from Ducati to the KTM bikes. For reference, on my Gas 350, I run a 44 Newton as well. Now, we've tested this bike on 3 different tracks. We took it to the roughest, toughest, baddest track in all the land, Glen Helen. We've been to Fox Raceway and Kahia Creek, all varying in track styles, that being jump sizes, terrain, the dirt, how the track forms up throughout the day. So I feel like both myself and JB really got to learn this bike in variety of conditions. This bike, again, was really good in stock form, is one of the highest performing bikes, in my opinion, in the 450cc paddock. And I'm really excited to see what it does once the full potential of this bike is truly unlocked. So thank you guys for watching. We're going to be having more content with this Desmo 450. We're going to report back to you guys some more findings on the forks and the shock, and then we'll be riding this bike in JBI spec form for the first time in just a few days. So I'm super excited. Stay tuned, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode.